Welcome back, Trek people! Today we're going back to the beginning of each Star Trek series and their rankings on this edition of...
Yeah, it's the best five, worst five, know what I mean? Yeah, it's the best five, worst five Treks ever seen.
Everything has to start somewhere, and Star Trek's original start was chaotic. While we tend to call all first episodes of any show a pilot, technically only TOS had a pilot, and even a second pilot, and neither were the first episode broadcast, as is tradition for a pilot. A pilot is ordered to see if a production company wants to make a series out of it, where the rest of Trek's iterations were fully ordered as a series, pilot unseen, and their first episodes are just that. Since there are currently 11 Trek shows, rather than the usual format, we'll just count these down from worst to first, and even talk about the clusterfluff that was Trek's troubled beginnings. Number 11. Encounter at Farpoint. An initial episode's most crucial job is to introduce us to our main characters, and when it comes to TNG's first foray, it actually does an okay job at this, and better than some of the other Trek first episodes. But aside from setting up a past between Riker and Deanna, and Picard's hatred of kids, the story is F-tier garbage. Q is the only interesting part of this episode, and even his recurring character isn't dialed in. I don't know if the courtroom scene would be remembered as fondly if it weren't bookended in the final episode. Cropler Zorn is one of the least interesting characters in all of Trek, and the model of the Bandy City is the worst practical model in all of Trek. The episode leaned too heavily into the classic TOS trope of humanity being tested and figuring out the mysteries of the galaxy, rather than paving its own path that separates it from its predecessor from 20 years prior. And the mystery being solved, ending as space jellyfish, feels like a shelved idea from the TOS days that leaves me wondering what I just watched. This is Trek's worst first by a very wide margin. Number 10. Beyond the Farthest Star. The animated series is an odd bird in the franchise as a whole. The first episode is nothing special and is just another single episode narrative, about as mediocre as the rest of the spin-off from TOS. The episode starts by telling us they're past the fringe of the galaxy, which contradicts a pretty big piece of canon in the Great Barrier that surrounds the galaxy. One of many reasons the series is currently considered non-canon. The most interesting part of the episode is probably the introduction of life support belts that I wish had gone on to be used in live-action shows. Like many stories in TAS, though, the ending feels like an afterthought and is almost an anticlimax. The Enterprise just kind of leaves and we don't get a real conclusion to what they found. Pretty middle of the road for the animated series, but pretty bad in comparison to other pilots and first episodes. Number 9. The Cage, Where No Man Has Gone Before, and The Man Trap. While The Cage didn't wow studio execs, it did lay enough groundwork to intrigue them, and more money was invested, and a rare second pilot was ordered. The Cage really does feel like a different animal compared to the rest of Trek we've come to know and love, and by itself isn't all that interesting. It feels like a chore to get through, and somehow turning it into a clip show and adding new contexts in the menagerie made it a much more interesting episode. Where No Man Has Gone Before absolutely feels more like what Star Trek would become, but I can definitely understand why even it was not chosen to be the first episode broadcast. While more interesting than The Man Trap, it also had a lot of technobabble and deep sci-fi to it, where The Man Trap has more all-around appeal for a general TV-watching audience that was more likely to pull them in. I feel that all three of these episodes are very close to each other in the grand scheme of all of Star Trek, and collectively hold the number 9 rank. Number 8. Caretaker. Like TNG, Voyager's first episode actually does a good job of introducing all the main characters, and sets up a premise of a ship lost at the wrong end of the galaxy. While its narrative is much easier to follow than Farpoint, it's kind of dull. and introduces probably the least interesting recurring villains in the form of the Kazon. It's the beginning of Trek's opening episodes not being cringy and bad, but also nowhere near a top-tier episode in the sea of nearly 900 episodes across the franchise. I guess this is what happens when you spend more on Kate Mulgrew's hair than you do on special effects. Number 7. The Vulcan Hello and Battle at the Binary Stars. Discovery probably has the weirdest start to a Star Trek series yet. There's not even a mention of the series' title hero ship, and the captain we're first introduced to is dead by the end of this two-parter. The only main character that gets any real amount of introduction is Michael Burnham. Rather than the traditional ensemble cast, this does lay out pretty firmly that this is the Michael Burnham show, and she has some supporting cast we'll come back to in the general run of the show. This is probably the worst Trek first step for introducing us to our main cast and setting up threads to pull on later in the series. However, it's the first on the list to actually have a pretty solid story going on in its first moments on television. Certainly the most action-heavy to date, as the origins of the angst between the Federation and the Klingon Empire are on full display. A pretty good episode of Star Trek, but not the best introduction to what we'd come to know in the series. Number 6. Second Contact. The satirical, yet largely canonical animated Trek series Lower Decks starts in a way that well displays what we'll see through the rest of the series. It does a great job introducing our 4 main characters and a plethora of the show's many recurring roles. The actual story that plays out is only okay, but it does feel closer to the rest of the show than many other Trek pilots end up doing. For Trek's silliest show, it made a serious impact with its initial episode. As we turn to the best 5 first episodes of Trek, if you're enjoying the content, please consider a like and subscribe. Number 5. Lost and Found. For the first Star Trek show targeted specifically at a younger audience, it has a lot of nuance and things going on in the narrative. It's probably the deepest amount of setup for a Trek show in its first episode, and might do the best job of introducing our characters. The story that plays out is only mediocre, and the fight scene with Dreadnought feels like every other kids show villain setup, but this is the setup for a great kids show that I didn't know I needed in my adult life. Number 4. Strange New Worlds. The popular modern show with the unimaginatively named first episode, my thoughts are very split on this episode. It doesn't do the best job of introducing all our main characters. Granted, we know a fair amount about some of the main characters already, but for the truly new characters like La'an and Ortegas, we merely learn names. The story for the first 2/3 of the episode doesn't captivate me, and if the episode were only 35 minutes, this would be much further down these rankings. What saves this as an episode is the way Pike uses Earth's history of conflict to help a pre-warp civilization that looks an awful lot like our real world in a mirror come together and address their deep differences before they wipe themselves out. For a weak start, this feels like the most classic preachy Trek message we've gotten in all of new Trek, and highlighted what this show was going to showcase, and what other shows like Discovery and Picard, while decent, were missing. Number 3. Remembrance. You can just throw the introduction of characters part of this pilot in the trash because this is the slowest burn of any Trek series. It takes 3 episodes to meet all of our main characters, but honestly this approach works really well. By the time we meet them all, we've got a really good idea who they are and what has brought them together. The entire first season fleshes them out into some of the most well-rounded main characters across the franchise, and they feel fully human. The narrative of the initial episode itself is great setup for the rest of the season of twists, turns, and misdirection. It really pulls you in and makes you want to see how the return to the 24th century is going to play out, Borg, Romulans, and a downtrodden Picard that shut himself away from the world, waiting to die. A very slow but satisfying first episode. Number 2. Emissary. As we've previously discussed, many Trek pilots had trouble juggling all the things that make a great first episode, and often dropped one or more of the balls. When it comes to DS9's opening foray, it nails character introduction, story, and setup for the next 7 seasons. We get some amount of backstory on all our main characters, while still leaving a bunch of mystique to be revealed over the run of the show. It does something very different than all other Trek, in that it sets up a major arc that doesn't resolve till the very last episode of the series. More than that, the story within the episode itself is captivating all the way through in a way that others below it haven't fully utilized in their runtime. An aptly great first episode of probably Trek's best show. And the best pilot in Trek history at number 1? Broken Bow. While the first season of Enterprise was off to a rocky start to the point that I didn't finish it and tuned the show out completely until about a decade after it went off the air, its opening episode is everything one could want. It absolutely does the best job introducing our main characters and a fair amount of their backstory. It has a great story in and of itself, starting with some of Trek's most iconic words, and then a Klingon being chased, culminating in an explosion. It's an exciting episode seeing humans' first foray into deep space. While it doesn't set up an arc like DS9, the trip to Rigel 10 is bookended in the show's final episode, and it does set up some recurring angst with the Suliban. For a pretty middle-of-the-road Trek show, its first episode hit a home run. What's your favorite first episode of Star Trek?